in this video, we're going to talk about calibration and the calibration procedure. So all calibration is where we send or we apply a known value to a measurement system, and we observe the output signal from that or the output from that measurement. All right, so we're putting known values in, and we're recording the response of the system. All right, so we can do two types of calibration: a static calibration, all right, and dynamic calibration. So static calibration is we apply known fixed amounts to the system. We record the output value, all right, and we can then determine the relationship between the two variables. So you can think of it as if we're saying y is a function of x, all right. So basically what we're doing for calibration is we're determining y as a function of x. Okay? So a dynamic calibration is basically when we add instead of our input being just independent of time, it has a time factor as well. So we can then use a dynamic calibration to determine the time-dependent response of our system. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the semester, but that's just the differences between the two. All right. Then static sensitivity is basically just the slope of our curve. All right. So typically it may be represented with the variable k. All right. So all it is taking the derivative of y with respect to x at a given point. Okay. So if a system is nonlinear, the slope or the change in the output with respect to the change in the input can be quite different, depending on the value that is being input into the sensor. All right, so it's important to know how sensitive your instrument is to a change in the input. Okay, so all right, and the last few things we're going to talk about are the range of a system. So the range is the operating range between the maximum and minimum values of the measurement. Okay, so there's also a range for the inputs and outputs of a measurement. So if you have like a scale, for example, all right, the input into the scale is the force that's being applied. All right, so there's a minimum force that's typically applied to a scale that is required to get any type of reading. All right, and then there's also a maximum. All right, that's going into the system. Okay, so the output of it is typically with like a style or something like that. Also has a minimum value and a maximum value. Okay. All right, now the span is the difference between the maximum and minimum of the input range. So you have a span for your input and your span for an output, which you can calculate using the minimum and the maximum for the output of the y variable and the input with the x variables. All right, and the last thing is regarding an instrument is the instrument's resolution. So the resolution is the smallest incremental value that may be determined for a given measurement system. Okay, so certain devices that measure very small forces, for example, would not be able to measure things that are very large, and things that are used to measure things that are very large can't measure very small changes in force. So you have to pick the appropriate instrument depending on what type of measurement range that you need and what the resolution that your measurement requires.